What if I told you she didn't destroy him? She destroyed the story he mistook for himself. Because there are women who come into a man's life, not to break his heart, but to reveal it. Not to betray his trust, but to dismantle the walls he built in its place. She didn't come for his strength. She came for the lie behind it. The carefully rehearsed identity held together by charm, control, and just enough vulnerability to be admired, but never truly seen. He thought he loved her, but what he loved was how he felt in her presence. Untouchable, validated, magnetic. He mistook her gaze for devotion, when really it was recognition, because she didn't see the mask. She saw the man beneath it, and that terrified him. He had spent years building a persona strong enough to seduce, clever enough to impress, distant enough to remain untouched. But she didn't fall for the persona. She touched the places it couldn't protect. And when he began to tremble, not in weakness, but in unfamiliarity, he called it danger. But it wasn't danger, it was awakening. Carl Jung once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." And he was no exception. He blamed her intensity. He pointed to her unpredictability. He told himself she was too much, when in truth she was too real for the illusion to survive. Because what he loved wasn't her. It was the fantasy she momentarily made possible. The dream of being held without ever having to unfold. The comfort of feeling chosen without having to be changed. But real feminine energy doesn't exist to comfort a man's ego. It exists to strip it, to burn off the layers of performance, to call forth the man buried beneath approval. And that's what she did. Without effort, without intention, without needing him to understand. She simply was, still, present, unmoved by his attempts to perform. She didn't flinch when he withdrew. She didn't chase when he went silent. And that silence, that unbearable stillness, was where the unraveling began. Because in her gaze, there was no reward, no flattery, no applause. There was only truth. And truth is rarely gentle to a man who's never lived it. He thought she was rejecting him, but what she rejected was the illusion. The game, the manipulation, the subtle self-abandonment dressed as confidence. She wouldn't play along. And in doing so, she became unbearable. Not because she was cruel, but because she asked nothing and yet revealed everything. Alan Watts said, "Muddy water is best cleared by leaving it alone." She left him alone, not out of punishment, but because she knew only in stillness does the illusion dissolve. And so he called her cold, distant, a storm. But in truth, she was the clear sky after the storm, the silence that echoes once the performance collapses. And in that silence, he now stands, not broken, but bare. Because she didn't break him. She dissolved the illusion he thought he had to be. She didn't tear him apart. She revealed that he was never whole to begin with. Because wholeness doesn't come from being admired. It comes from being known. And he had spent his life performing to be admired while hiding the parts that needed to be healed. She didn't fall in love with the act. She waited to see if he would step off the stage, waited to meet the man behind the monologue. But he hesitated because that man was still bleeding, still ashamed of softness, still angry at silence, still afraid of being seen without armor. So when she sat in front of him, unblinking, unmoved, uncowed by his charisma or control, he felt exposed and mistook it for attack. Because when a woman doesn't react to the tricks you've mastered, you either meet her with truth or you run. He ran, not with his body, but with his ego. He returned to cleverness, to manipulation, to claiming she was the problem. She's cold. She's impossible. She wants too much. No, she wanted only one thing, what he couldn't yet give, authenticity. And it wasn't the lack of love that drove her away. It was the lack of courage, because love for her was sacred, not sentimental, not transactional, not something to trade for comfort. She wanted depth, presence, a man willing to step into his shadow and say, "This is me, not just the light, but the places I've locked away." But he wasn't ready because he hadn't suffered enough to see that suffering wasn't his enemy. Carl Jung taught that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. She saw his darkness, not to shame it, but to invite it, to welcome it back into his body, to remind him that even his most broken parts were worthy of love. But when you've been raised to suppress, to earn your worth through stoicism and strength, a woman who asks you to feel can feel like a threat. She didn't want to control him. She wanted him to feel himself, not through her approval, but through his own presence. That's why she was so still, so calm, so unwilling to play small. He couldn't seduce her because she didn't need him. He couldn't manipulate her because she wasn't trying to win him. She was already home in herself, and she wanted to meet the part of him that knew how to be at home too. But all he knew was the pursuit, the chase, the performance. So when the audience didn't clap, he assumed the play was over. But she wasn't looking for theater, she was looking for truth. Alan Watts said, "The real you is not a puppet which life pushes around. The real you is the whole universe experiencing itself." She wanted to meet that universe in him, not the puppet. And when he wouldn't drop the strings, she walked away. Not as punishment, but as prophecy. Because one day he would remember her, not with longing, but with reverence. Not for what she gave, but for what she refused to accept. She didn't break him. She freed him from the illusion he mistook for love. And now in her absence, that freedom aches. He doesn't cry for her. He cries for what he lost of himself in her absence. Because what she awakened wasn't just desire. It was awareness. A memory of a man he'd never had the courage to fully be. She was not a fantasy. She was a frequency. And in her presence, he resonated with something ancient, something quiet, something true. And now that she's gone, he's deafened by the noise he once called normal. Because every other connection now feels like echo, flat, scripted, safe. He tries to love again, to feel again. But women who want the mask can't reach the marrow. And he longs for marrow. He longs for the man he became in the stillness of her gaze. Not because she gave it to him, but because she refused to let him pretend. That was her power. She didn't bend. She didn't explain. She didn't soothe his story. She simply stood, bare and whole, and waited to see if he would meet her there. But meeting a woman like that requires death, not of the body, but of the lie. The lie that he has to earn love through effort, through image, through exile of his feelings. Carl Jung called it individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you actually are, not who the world rewards. Not who your parents praised, not who your last lover needed, but you, beneath the layers. And that's who she saw. The man beneath the mask, the child beneath the control, the sacred masculine buried in armor and ambition. She touched that man with silence, with truth, with a kind of still devotion that said, "I will not play along with your avoidance, but I will wait for as long as it takes for you to come home to yourself." But he didn't know how to receive that because he was used to being chased, not challenged. He mistook her stability for distance, her clarity for coldness, her boundaries for rejection. So he ran right back into the arms of women who asked for less, who fed his ego instead of reflecting his emptiness. And for a while it worked, until the illusion cracked, until her absence became more honest than any presence he could find. Alan Watts wrote, "There will always be suffering, but we must not suffer over the suffering." And yet that is exactly what he does. Not because she left, but because he wasn't ready to stay. Not with her, but with himself. She didn't need him to become someone new. She needed him to remember, to soften, to open, to stand naked in the mirror and say, "I was never broken, only pretending." She didn't break him. She dissolved the illusion he clung to, the one that kept him liked but never loved. And now he feels the difference. And it haunts him. He will tell the story in pieces. He will say, "She left." He will say, "She couldn't handle me." But he will not say what matters most. She saw him, and that was unbearable. Because when a woman truly sees a man, not for what he performs, but for what he is, he has no more shadows to hide in. And she didn't look away. She didn't soothe his discomfort or rescue him from the mirror. She let the reflection stand, unblinking, unmoving, unforgiving in its truth. And the truth was this: he loved the idea of being loved, but not the reality of being revealed. She didn't want his praise, she wanted his presence. And presence that terrifying stillness of being without needing to prove, perform, or please was the one thing he hadn't mastered. She wasn't asking him to change. She was asking him to stop changing to be loved. But that felt like death, because for years he had been chosen for the mask. He had been rewarded for the performance. And now here was a woman who would only accept what he'd never shown. Carl Jung would call her the anima, the unconscious feminine within him mirrored in human form. She didn't appear to fulfill him. She appeared to awaken him. But awakening is not a gentle process. It burns, it scrapes, it leaves nothing untouched. He thought he needed her touch, but what he truly needed was the space she left behind, the quiet, the ache, the invitation. Because in the echo of her absence, he could finally hear himself. Not the voice of his pride, not the echo of his lineage, not the judgment of a world that told him masculinity meant muting his soul, but the real voice, low, steady, buried under years of pretending. Alan Watts said, trying to define yourself is like trying to bite your own teeth. He had tried, oh how he had tried, to define himself through careers, women, control, perfection. But she wouldn't play along, because love for her was not about identity, it was about essence. And she wouldn't stay so long as he insisted on being someone else. She didn't want to change him, she wanted him to shed. Not for her, but for himself. And that's why it hurt so much when she left. Because she didn't abandon him, she simply stopped making space for the version of him that wasn't real. She didn't break him, she broke the image he loved more than his truth. And now he stands in the ruins of that image. Alone, yes, but finally free. It takes time to grieve a version of yourself that never truly lived. The one you built to be accepted. The one who knew how to impress, but not how to feel. The one who could seduce, but not surrender. The one who could speak endlessly, but say nothing real. And in losing her, he lost him. Not the man others admired, but the man who only existed when she was near. Because in her presence, he didn't need to perform. He was not tested. He was not measured. He was simply mirrored. And that was what he came to crave. Not her body, not her laughter, but the version of himself that only appeared in her light. But mirrors are not homes. They reflect. They do not remain. She didn't stay because staying would have meant sacrificing her wholeness for the comfort of his illusion. And she had already done that in 1,000 lifetimes, no more. She didn't demand his transformation. She revealed it was possible. And then she left because the invitation had been made. And now the question hangs like silence. Will he accept it? Will he dig into the places she pointed to without needing her finger to remain pressed there? Will he learn to feel without needing her presence as permission? Will he finally, quietly, without applause, become the man she once saw in passing? That is his work now. Not to win her back, but to return to himself. Not to chase the muse, but to embody what she awakened. Because what once felt like rejection now feels like initiation. He was never broken. He was never abandoned. He was simply invited into his own becoming. And in time, he may learn that the pain she left in her absence was not punishment. It was the echo of his own suppressed longing, finally finding air. Alan Watts said, "You are under no obligation to be the same person you were 5 minutes ago." And that is his freedom now. To no longer chase validation, to no longer seduce from insecurity, to no longer wear a face that keeps his soul in hiding. He doesn't need her gaze to remember. He only needs to close his eyes and feel the truth she once stood for. That the woman he thought he lost was never the prize. The prize was the man he is now free to become. She didn't break him. She dissolved the illusion he loved. And in that dissolution, he was born.